Today is the 5th of June 2013. We're here at the School of Architecture in St. Lucia interviewing Margie Ward about her architectural education and experience, and interviewing you as Deborah van der Plaat and myself, Janina. So our first question is, what architecture qualifications did you gain and which institutions did you get them from?
I went to University of Queensland straight after school at the age of 17 and obtained a Bachelor of Architecture within that time, that 6 years. So it was a 3-year, then a year off, and then another 2 years. It wasn't a 2-degree course then.
I was just going to ask what years were it?
1969 to 1974.
1974. So wait, that was completely full-time?
Completely, yeah, full-time.
Yeah, and there was a year in between, or you just
Yes, there was a year off. So I travelled that year with another girl from the year. There were just 2 of us. When we started, there were 6 women, but it dropped very quickly to 2 women. And we were an oddity because we were born on the same day, in the same year, in the same hospital.
Really?
And we're both left-handed.
So, and who was the other woman that?
Helen Josephson. Helen has since died. She died in 2002.
Can you remember who the other women were that started the degree with you?
Laurie Simpson. That's anyone I can remember. They left very quickly before
Within that first year?
Yeah, before the first. Yeah, there was just the 2 of us in second year.
Second year, okay.
Yeah, so they dropped out very quickly.
And why did you decide to study architecture?
I wanted to. I went to I was always artistic as a child. I went to an exhibition must have been in what we call grade 9, which was sub-junior in those days, at the museum, and it was on Scandinavian design, which would have been 1964.
And that's the Brisbane Museum, was it?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, where the old Brisbane Museum. And I was transfixed, transformed, couldn't get enough of it. It just blew me away. So I came back. I was just, seriously moved. I can still remember the feeling. And I came back to school and I said, this is what I want to do. I want to be a designer, an architect. And so I went off to meet with Lindy Crofts, whom you may interview.
We have interviewed her.
I went to school with her sister, Wendy. And Lindy talked to me about doing architecture. I don't remember much about that except that there was a vision of a woman doing it and she seemed okay. But the vision was stronger than that, way stronger than that. That wouldn't have stopped me.
What do you mean by vision?
That after that exhibition,
Oh, okay.
yeah, I knew that was where I wanted to be. Yeah.
What was in the exhibition? Can you remember what types of works were they displaying?
Furniture, glassware. There may have been some architecture photographs, but it was at a time when Scandinavian architecture was beginning to have an influence in Australia, and there was the wife of one of the lecturers. What's his name? De Grucci. His wife, Joy De Grucci, set up a shop in Toowong with Marimekko goods. I couldn't stay out of it. It was that there was this big, I guess, a wave of influence of Scandinavian design, and I just loved it. So it was what drove me. So I went back to school, and they then actually fine-tuned my course so that I could do it. So I did art and physics and maths, which was not what women normally did. So so I've got to hand it to the school that they listened and they got me to.
Well, that's my next question. Were they supportive of that sort of?
They were very supportive, and that was at Girls' Grammar, which was up on the hill. Now on Gregory Terrace, which was just near the museum.
Mm-hmm.
Now I had an aha moment, which is I'm very ashamed of, but just this year I was sitting with some PhD students in the quiet room. We were having a bit of lunch, and there's this older woman there. She'd be 10 years older, 10 years younger than me. But I'm really old. Anyway, she said, asked me the question, how were you influenced to do architecture? And I said, I just knew I wanted to do it, and I did it. And she said, did you go to a private school? And I said, yes, I did. And she said, that's why. That I went to a public school, and the assumptions made around women doing those courses were much stronger. This was an all-girls school with a career, high academic aspirations, and I had assumed, I had taken that for granted, and so I'm very humbled by that my Silvertail start in life influenced where I went from then.
And allowed it to happen.
And allowed it to happen.
Yeah.
And nobody questioned it, really. My parents went with it. Now the other, I did know that it was, there was no free university then, so, and I won a Commonwealth scholarship, and I remember thinking, I just got it. So I wasn't a great student, but they pushed me through and got it. I got it. And I remember thinking that I would not have done the course if I hadn't have got the scholarship, because it was so long, and my parents had other children, 3 other children, and that I had this sense that I should do something a bit more sensible if they had to pay the fees. But because they didn't have to pay the fees, I went and did it. Now, whether that was my assumption, I didn't have to test it.
You're free to do it.
So there were some things working for me. One was that I went to a school with high academic aspirations that had few assumptions around the role of women. They listened and they catered for me, and I was ungrateful. Always thought school was horrible. But reflecting, they were pretty terrific.
So once you got to university, did you still find that sort of openness when you got here, that the course was open to women in architecture?
Yes, we were on the wave of women's lib. I remember, and a couple of things happened. The whole coming to university after a private school threw me. I didn't understand the freedom, I guess the equity of talking to my lecturers by their first name. But I went with it really quickly. I just lapped it up. I just loved it. I loved the life. I had a ball. I just had the best time. And I had a very strong family support. Number one, I had enough money, and I had a boyfriend who was from another world. Right? He was a farmer and a footballer. So I kept two worlds. I had my crazy university, mushroom smoking, marijuana, crazy life over here, and then I was an AFL groupie over here. So, and I never let the two mix, and that was a nice balance.
So you said that you started with 6 women your first year, that soon dropped to 2, but how many men were there? Do you remember? More or
There were
less?
42 in the year when we started, and we finished with 17.
Okay.
And who were some of your teachers in those early years?
Look, I was in there. I thought, God, I can't remember. I'll tell you the ones I remember or had an influence. Peter O'Gorman had a very strong influence on me. He was very encouraging. He was only young. He was only 29. We were 17. He was. Bill Carr. He was wild and crazy and felt me up occasionally, but he was lovely because he was so wild, and naughty. Stan Marcus Kyle was the father figure, and I remember weeping in his room. I don't know what I'm doing. And he'd hand you a tissue and listen and send you off. He was gorgeous. Ian Cinnamon, distant. I was a bit frightened of Ian, still am. They're the ones I can remember. Obviously lots more. Bill, I can't remember now, but they're the ones that influenced me. And certainly Peter O'Gorman I stayed in touch with for many years after.
And what do you remember about the curriculum? What were they teaching? Were they doing studio, or who was doing what?
We worked very hard, very hard. I remember working hours and hours and hours. I was an above average student. I don't think I was brilliant, but I had great support behind me. Mum would cook me, chop and 3 veg, and it was there, and she would be there when I came home. Now this is a bit naughty, but I'd come home exhausted, and she would say, we'd sit in the kitchen and have a cigarette together. It's the old days. And she was just I had this lovely supported life. So but I had friends whose lives were really, really tough. They didn't have enough money, they were paying their fees, they were eating badly. I remember Graham Davis nearly starving, so in that regard, I should have done reasonably well compared to the others. I had a car to get around to pick up materials and things that a lot of the others didn't have.
And the courses were taught here?
No, we were in the tower and in the bottom of the psychology building. This building wasn't here.
And what was Peter O'Gorman? He taught studio?
Yes.
And do you remember any of the projects that you were working on throughout the years, or your thesis project, or?
We didn't. My thing has always been housing, and so they're the ones I remember. So right from the beginning in first year, doing my first house to a big housing complex in final year. I'm sure there were lots of other things in between, but it was the housing ones that I was really, that's where my interest started to go at that point, yeah. I did my thesis, we did an undergraduate thesis on West End Shopping Centre and how that would be, how that could become more, it was trying to address the strip shopping centre in a community that was very vibrant and wanted community life much more than most 60s or 70s communities, suburbs at that point. And there were some very poor development ideas happening, like a huge Coles nearby, which would have undermined that Greek community life. So that was my thesis, was about how that strip shopping centre could be enhanced. You know, Boundary Road hasn't changed much since then.
But as I understand it, sort of that southern end of Brisbane was very different because it was much more industrial based too, along the river there, so that would have had a very different...
I have a funny story about that. One of the projects we had was to design a hotel. In those days, women weren't allowed in public bars, so I wanted to find out how a public bar worked. So I got a job as a barmaid, and so where I could get in. You know, so I got a job as a barmaid. So I had to learn how to pull a beer, and then I didn't know about whiskey chasers or rum chasers, or going like mad try to observe, and I had this wonderful cousin, older cousin, who's a very gracious man from Sydney, who was in town. It was my mother's cousin. And here am I pulling beers and pouring whiskey chasers and anyway, came in and he was in a full suit, tie. This is a very rough bar down in South Brisbane. He came in this full suit and he handed me a bunch of violets across the bar, and the whole bar just stopped and like my cover was blown. Anyway, yeah. So from that, we had to be a little bit more creative, I suppose, as women to find out things and do things.
Yeah. And in the year off, you said that together with Helen Josephson you travelled.
Yeah,
where did you go?
We were mates, and we were really good mates right through our, until she died, really. It was a great loss to me. She and I planned this trip. We were going to Europe, and our plan was we had all these buildings we were going to visit, but if anything distracted us, that was fine. So that was the plan. So we did keep pretty well to plan, but we had some wild times too.
So what were some of the buildings on your plan?
We did Paris, and we went down. We did Corbusier's chapel.
Rocha.
Rocha. Remember that. Went down to Italy, and we wanted to see Alberobello. We were chased out of Alberobello. We got very frightened there because not many single women went down to that area of Calabria. I remember we hid in a garage behind a Cinquecento. This man was hunting for us, and finally some woman said, "You better get out of town." Told us to go. It was quite hairy, yeah. That was 1972, so then we just got on a bus to the coast, and we were the only two on the bus, and I was sure we were going to be raped and killed. I just had that, when you're this community had put us on the bus and said, we got to take it somewhere. Anyway, we did. We got to the coast to Monopoly and down, so it was all right. But yeah, we pushed the boundaries a little bit. And then over to Athens. We had our 21st birthday on a Greek island. That was one goal. It was very indulgent, really. And Helen fell for a Greek architect called Paris. So it was Helen and Paris. And they had a little fair, and I'm still in touch with Paris. He's an architect on roads. He's a conservationist architect on roads. Yeah. So yeah, over 40 years later, he's there, tucked away. Then we went over to United States. Went over to Chicago. We flew into Chicago, and where I was frisked and told that they would let me in against their better judgment. And so we had a great, I don't know quite why we worried people, but we were, anyway, we had a great time in Chicago. We met up with an architect there who's still in touch with me, Rick Rose, and then back to New York. Came home. So that's
Quite a trip.
Yeah, it was great. It was a really good thing to do, and we came. I think the lesson for us, we if I were to think about it architecturally and career-wise, the one, it made us grow up, but two, Helen and I worked for an architectural firm, and I tried to find out the name of it. I could not think that anyway, but we were working on the maternity hospital at Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, and it was an all Israeli women team of architects.
Interesting.
And doing this particular project in a much bigger firm, and that was like a brain snap, the way Israeli women worked and behaved and got things done, and I came back to Brisbane and I thought, no, I'm not taking any shit from anybody anymore. Yeah, it was a real affirmation.
So that was while you were overseas that you worked on that?
Oh, it was just it was a couple of months. We worked in London we're just working as contract draftsmen.
Yes.
How did you find that work?
Oh, it was heaps of work around. Went to an agency, picked up within a day. We were what you call now CAD monkeys. We just getting out the ceiling layouts and stuff. But it was the environment that was so refreshing for us.
So you think in London at that time, or Oxford I should say, they were more open to women practicing in architecture, or was it just this particular group of women who had this project?
I'm not sure. No, I didn't do much thinking about that really. We were just having too much fun. But I do remember reflecting on just the assumption that these women could do it. There was never any question.
Which in itself is very telling,
Yeah,
I think, at the time
Now,
too.
Brisbane was pretty backward. I got my first job as a student in the Department of Public Works, and this is in 1969, in the Christmas of 1969. And at the Christmas party, the director got up and made a speech, and he said, "This is a momentous year. This is the year that the man landed on the moon, and we've got our first girl student in the works department." where we were. So, yeah.
You're talking in your trip about going off and seeing Ronsham and things like that. Did you get a lot of sort of like history type subjects when you were studying here at UQ? And
No,
that you can remember?
no, just in the early part of the degree. In reflection, I think it was, we were part of the new wave that, there was psychology, there was some social studies, there was history, there was quite a lot of experimenting happening. I think I was very young and did not appreciate it to the extent I could have. I would have now. I would have been far more curious and eating it up. And it was the era of drugs, sex and rock and roll. We had so much going on. There was the anti-Vietnam demonstrations. There was lots of work around Indigenous people. There was always something going on at the Refect. There were people speaking, there were marches, there was lots and lots of activity that kept you firing in all sorts of different directions. There was a lot of drug taking, soft drugs, hash, marijuana and mushrooms. I didn't get into it. I wasn't interested. I did drink like a fish, drank appallingly, and drove. It's lucky I'm alive, really. I was never sexually accosted, which is surprising. I think we were all pretty naive, really. We had a couple of people in the year that were homosexual, and it never even crossed my mind. I had no concept. It wasn't that I was prejudiced. It was an era where they didn't talk about it. They weren't game to talk about it, I would think. But once we graduated, it became clear, and we had more adult conversations, because we were.
So did all those sorts of social issues that are happening, the Vietnam War and so forth, did they impact on the types of projects you were doing here within the school and your design projects?
No, I felt we were pretty isolated, really. We just trucked along in our own sort of bubble. I knew about those issues because of other people, not so much from within the faculty. We were pretty rarefied, I think. We were also working very hard, very long hours.
So when you said you're doing projects on housing, you did mention the idea sort of the community Greek concepts sort of integrating into that West End project. When you think back to some of those housing projects you did, can you think of some of the sort of ideas and concepts that were coming through then, or you were being encouraged to explore? Was there anything?
No. From my position now, where I've been thinking about housing for a long time, I'm wistful about that, and I'm actually very, there was a gap there, and we didn't address social issues to the extent I think they would be addressed now. We did a project on Indigenous centre, and it was Dennis Walker, who was I don't know if you know who Dennis Walker is. He was his mother was named Walker. She was Ujuru. Her son, he was in a whole lot of trouble. He was in and out of jail, all that. I said to my mum, being real middle class whiteys, I said, I'm going to interview Dennis Walker about this project, and she said, take the dog. I had a sleepy old cattle dog. So I thought, okay, the dog went in the back. She was fine. Sort of level of, what do I do about this? My daughter, 19, heading off to talk to this, man who'd been in and out of jail and caused all sorts of ructions and was Aboriginal. So there's a bit of that. But I really enjoyed that project. It really challenged me. But I think about now the level of thinking around those issues are just so much more sophisticated and thoughtful and I guess challenging now than we would have then.
Mm-hmm. So what would have been the focus of those projects when you were doing them? There's some, occasionally you just talked about one where you did look at social issues, but were they climatic? Were they formal? What were the sorts of things you were being encouraged to explore?
Movement in space. There was climatic. We did a lot of climatic work, or environmental design work. We did nothing about access, which is my thing now. Nothing. But that was the world anyway. Certainly, equity of access or how building can hurt people. We didn't talk about that at all. How building can cause apartheid and segregation and exclusion and that. No, we didn't do any of that. No. It was a wonderful course. I came out unprepared for the world, but I hear that over and over and over again. I have reflected on that a lot since. I think I'm grateful for my education because it was such fun. It was just full of ideas and interesting people and crazy plans. And I was in classical stuff, and I was, we did an architecture, conference on a train. Have you heard about that? Have you heard about the train? And we all went to Sydney to see hair, and to the Archie conference down there. So all those wonderful experiences for a young kid, a young woman, they were really happy days.
As a student, did you admire any local architects?
Yeah, well, again, I thought about that. You asked that question. I thought, John Dalton and Pat Moroney were also tutoring us, so I loved their work. Helen went off and worked for James Birrell. I can't quite come at James Birrell because I know he was very dismissive of equity of access and all those things. So I've got a career overlay there that I can't quite bring myself to him now. And I know how awful he was as a man. I was friends with his daughter. So, there's things I can't quite come at, I'm sure, but I'm very intrigued by what he did for Queensland at that time. So I'm a bit torn there. I lived in a Hazen Scott house, and not as a student but later, and while their names were sort of thrown around, then I became, as a wife and mother of little children living in a Hazen Scott house, I blessed them because they got it. They got it about architecture, women, and housing.
It's an interesting comment. Why do you say that?
Well, the house was built in 1953. It was oriented 12 degrees east of north with through breeze. So in Brisbane, I could just throw it all open, and it was coolest. It was a wonderful house. It had a courtyard in the front, facing the street. There was a courtyard facing north where the kids could play, and I could hang out the washing and all sorts of sort of kid, homey little people, mums at homey type activities could happen in the sun out the front, and I could see it all from the kitchen window, and the laundry was off the kitchen into this courtyard. It was step free. I had a child in a wheelchair at that time, so you know it was just heaven. Worked so beautifully. It was inexpensive house. It was humble. It was courteous to the street. I don't think we've done better architecture, domestic architecture in Queensland.
And where was this house?
It was on Swan Road. It's been knocked down. We sold it. It's knocked down. It should have been classified.
So you worked in the public works department, and where else did you work? Did you work in other places during your studies?
Worked for Lund Hutton Newell for a short period, but that's all. I mainly worked for the Department of Public Works.
And when did you work for Lund Hutton Newell?
Oh God, 1970. So, and then I ran away to Sydney with a love interest whom I married, and set up my own practice down there. So,
Before we get on to your own practice, what sort of projects were you doing at Public Works?
we did the Toowoomba College of Education. It was then. It's now the university up there at Toowoomba. And that was a very good experience because I did lots of site visits, and they were mainly educational buildings, and there were some other ones too. Yeah.
And who were some of your colleagues at that time in Works?
Oh, Gary May. Remember Gary May? Hayes around. Should be in this room. Look, I can't remember them. I wasn't particularly, because it was just holiday work. You know, I just went in. Peter Pristupa ran the thing with Alf Camels were the two guys at that time. Peter Pristupa was very supportive, but had a roving hand. So you had to be real careful. Just, you know, you got to remember there was no protection for women in those days. You just had to be smart or get yourself into situations.
And do you remember any of the projects or the project you worked on at Lund Hutton Newell when you were there?
Oh, look, I was only there a short time. Yeah, no, it was just housing, you know, small things.
Alright, also moving on to your practice in Sydney. How long were you there for?
Well, I need to, my career is very shabby, and as an architect, and I think it's important, well, I'm hoping it's of use to you, because life doesn't flow, life intervenes. So in a quick chronological order, so you're aware of my story, I left here and went to Sydney, where it was beginning of 1975, which was high inflation. You know, life was, you know, everything was stopping. So most of the students went to Darwin to to clean up after the cyclone. So you may get that story from right here. I followed my heart, went to Sydney. Now I got a job as a project officer at Sydney Hospital, and they had some money to just finish some jobs there. Now, my father, my name was Tong, T-O-N-G-E, and my father was the government pathologist at the time. And I arrived at Sydney Hospital and they said, "You're the perfect person because we need the morgue refurbished." And I said, "It's my father that does the postmortems, not me." Okay? So they said, no, but you know all about this, you'll be fine. So my first job, was to step around the cadavers and redo the morgue. And then to find a builder that would go into the place. Oh, God. I had this Maltese builder who behaved extraordinarily about all that. Anyway, so I spent some time, about 18 months doing that, and then I went out on my own with another. We just decided we'd go out and do it, and I worked as a room service waitress at the Cross at the same time. So in the morning I'd get up at 6, work till 10:30, change out of my pink bolero and go to work in my little office. And I was putting my husband through law. So that was pretty cute. And then is that what I did? Or maybe, anyway, I had a stint out at Westmead Hospital where they were doing fast tracking, and there were just rows and rows of young architects getting the drawings out, building this huge hospital. And then I had this little practice, and I set up with S.B. Dodds, who was my cousin. I don't know if you know S.B. from Sydney. Okay, he's my cousin. He's lovely to me. He was really smart, and I was this gormless kid from Brisbane, but we ran this little practice together for 3 years. And we had such fun. And he just sent me a card the other day of Mark Foy's. We were just near Mark Foy's, and we used to go over and have pineapple donuts and coffee on Mark Foy's foyer when we couldn't think of what else to do. Anyway, in 1979 I fell pregnant by accident, and I was very sad about that because I loved this little practice that we had together, and I was just getting a cash flow, and we were doing quite well. I was doing additions and alterations to housing in inner North Sydney and eastern suburbs. So Jeremy just got through law, and we had to move to Newcastle because I had this baby and he had to earn the money. So I closed my little practice down and went and became a mother. And my first child had multiple disabilities, so I had to do a major rethink then, and I had a little job offer part-time job offer with an architect in Newcastle, Brian Suter. Anyway, I don't know what I was doing, but I had to say no because I had a whole new career ahead of me. So we came back to Brisbane with this little baby, and I spent the next, and that's where we bought the Hazen Scott. And I had 3 other kids, and so I spent 12 years as a mother. And then in 1991 there was a job for someone to establish the disability section within the Department of Housing. So this was just when Goss came in, so I went for that job and got it, selling my interest in housing, my disability networks, and because I've become a pretty strong disability activist by this point. So and architectural background. So for the next 5 years I worked there, and we built. I didn't build them, but I told architects what they needed to do. shifted the housing design strategies from the old school to universal design, accessible design, and really pushed that whole thing. So we also did, I was in the forefront of the deinstitutionalisation that happened, the closure institutions for people with mental illness, and to work out ways for them to live in regular housing. So I got into a lot of housing policy. At that point, my daughter was about to leave school, so I had to think how to support her in a job. So I left the public service and I became a stoley at South Bank, and we made cards and soap and taught her how to work, and gradually had built an adult life for her, getting her own home, working out the supports for her and those things. So that it was a very different life, but the architectural training was very helpful through all of that, and project management training. I went back and did more policy work in housing, and then established a national group to further the idea of universal design in housing, and then a state group. So my networks are quite extensive in Australia around that, and then my daughter died in 2009. So my husband said, what was his question? If you were to die tomorrow, what would you regret? So I said, I want to finish my housing work. And he said, well, out the door, off you go. So I went to QUT for a number of reasons. One was that my son was here doing architecture, and there's nothing worse than finding your mother in the corridor. Secondly, this school was not interested in the issue. I need to be frank. While Greg Bamford had been a champion, there was very little interest elsewhere, and I had been constantly monitoring over the years who was taking action, who was stepping up, who was speaking out. So I went to QUT where there was more interest, and so I did my degree, my postgraduate degree there, and here I am. That's the story.
So what's next?
I don't know. I'll remain active in this, and it's coming up to a very interesting time. And I actually met with there's a national program, a voluntary program, which is really an outcome of a lot of that work, not necessarily mine. I had to go underground for 3 years while Nina was dying. So, but the person who followed me got that work done, and then I came back in, and there's a national program in place which is aiming for all new housing to provide minimum access features by 2020. Now, the next period of time from 2014 to 2020 is going to be crucial how that happens, and it will be a very significant advocacy project. I will be in the midst. I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen. I have plans.
Schemes coming up. Well, it's a fascinating career, and it's a really, really interesting story. Can you think of any
No, I think, well, you've told the story, and I think the rest of the questions will pretty apply to your story, so.
Well, I suppose the only other thing I can sort of think of is what do you think of the current state of Queensland architecture?
I'm out of it on one level because I'm focusing so much on housing, and architects don't play a big role in housing. They do bespoke housing, and they set fashion and some trends, but mainstream housing and how it's provided and how people approach housing, architects aren't on the page, and they missed the boat with the Hayes and Scott period because those guys and their colleagues, and I'm sitting there thinking, I'm such a dope. Who's what was the company that built half of Kenmore? Griffin and Nolman. They were doing very thoughtful, affordable, environmentally sound housing in the 50s and 60s, and I saw it, though I didn't understand it, but the architecture world, the architecture profession dropped the bundle there, and this moved into the land of developers and building designers and weird fashion trends. Now there's a political element in here, but the architects just weren't in the game. They didn't have the vision. They didn't see to grasp the nettle here and guide that built environment development. That's a whole thesis in itself. I don't know why that happened, but they had the chance, they had the leadership in the 50s and 60s, post-war. There was some world-class work happening. And then the baton was dropped.
And you think it's because the sort of developers took over that sort of mass-produced housing?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I don't understand why it happened. And I did follow the public housing scene, and I think that is tied into it. But I don't know. I did see architects come in and influence the public housing architecture in the early 90s under Goss, because I was right in there. I wouldn't have picked it up otherwise, because typically public housing is like shabby architecture. You don't go there. Right? It is the most crucial architecture. This is where you can change people's lives. That's what I knew when I was working in there. I saw humble, respectful, well-designed, well-appointed buildings changing people's lives, not just making their lives better, saving lives, changing lives. And if I was an educator, I would really want my students to know that they had that power. But it isn't talked about much.
All right. Anything else we've...
So maybe I'll become a lecturer.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything.
No, unless you want to add something, I think we can wrap up.
Yep, we've come to the hour.
No, I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Brian, thank you.